Hello, and thank you for downloading the Scrip Intelligence podcast. My name is Mike Ward, and I'm the editor at Scrip Intelligence. Today, we're going to be looking at the phenomenon of stealth investment, as well as discussing why pharmaceutical companies are looking to build their presence in the rare disease indications. I'm joined by Scrip contributing editor John Hodgson. Earlier this week, we both attended the Biopartnering Europe meeting here in London, where stealth investment and rare diseases were the focus of much debate. John, you represented Scrip on a panel that attempts to forecast what the industry can expect in the coming year. Discussion has always turned to the biotech industry's ability to raise money, and in particular the emergence of what is called stealth investment. For the benefit of our listeners, John, could you explain what is meant by stealth investment and why it is so important?
Yes, Mike. Well, it was actually Andy Richards who raised the topic of stealth investing. Andy's an angel investor based in Cambridge in the UK, and he seems to take a generally optimistic view of the investing environment. So last year when I presented some data at the same bioforecasting panel on early stage investment in biotech and life sciences, which essentially showed that the numbers were about 50% of the previous year's numbers, which in turn were down on 2008. Andy questioned the data. At least he said he believed the data, but underneath those headlines, which everybody knew about, was a swathe of stealth investments, which had crept beneath everybody's radar. I'm not quite sure whether I believed him at the time, partly because he didn't come out with any specific data or instances about it. But it does seem to be happening. So some of the things that he was talking about as being in the category of stealth investments are where a venture capital company will go in with a very early round, maybe less than £1 million, euros, dollars, or whatever, just to test the water with the company. And another instance was some of the incubation funds based at universities like Imperial College and their innovations group, which is able to put small amounts of money into a company to start with and perhaps follow on. And they've got no reason necessarily to publicize this to any great extent. So I think that's what he meant by stealth investing. I'm not sure how to quantify it. Yeah,
but I guess that, on the one hand, what he's saying is that he's seeing plenty of opportunities for him as an angel investor to put some money in. And, if he's picked the right things, he's going to make some money, and that's clearly what he has done. Whereas when one looks at the money that's actually going into the whole biotech sector, then what we're actually sort of seeing is that there was, for example, I think you were right, last year, less money was being put to work in the biotech sector. This year, however, I think that we actually have seen more money being put to work. And in fact, the levels that were put in the third quarter, which we reported recently in Scrip, was about the sort of the normal. It was about $1.5 billion, between 1.4 and 1.5, which is back to more or less the previous year's levels. But the question there really is, where is it distributed? I mean, is it going into the later rounds, or is it venture capitalists reinvesting in existing companies to keep the portfolio going, or is it something that is more innovative or going into the earlier stage? That's a very interesting question, because in fact, what an analysis of where the money was going, about half of it was actually existing investors having to put more money into their companies to keep them going, to do the kind of the experiments that are needed to demonstrate that value is being created. So it might be to get that proof of concept that's then going to attract either the attention of pharmaceutical companies, or alternatively is a way of actually bringing more money at a later stage, where people sort of think, actually, these guys have now shown what they can do. So about half the money's going in there. However, about half the money was actually going into very, very early stage. And so what Andy was sort of saying was, where we're talking about stealth investment, actually it wasn't that stealthy, because we see that there's a few.
It's not a complete secret, is it?
It isn't a secret. I can see the advantages of keeping things below the radar, because
what would they be? I mean, I don't quite get why you want to keep it quiet. Although, there's no reason for a company to brag about its money raising, I suppose.
Well, the reason why you might want to keep it quiet is as long as you can get the money in the first instance. So if you've got either, some rich angels or, one investor who's prepared to put in the 250,000 to $1 million that might be required to do those key experiments, if when you've done those key experiments, you can then sort of show that to the pharmaceutical company, the advantage is that, one, it hasn't been shopped around. So the pharmaceutical company kind of sort of thinks, hey, we're the first people to get to look at this. This looks very, very exciting. So, for example, Pangenetics, which was essentially invested in by Index Ventures and then latterly by Novo Ventures, those two guys, they were able to put some money into a nerve growth factor asset. Some key experiments were done. They were then able to sell that asset very, very early stage to Abbott for a stonking amount of money, sort of about $180 million.
But there's a suggestion here that basically the pharma companies are neophiliacs, which is to say, they're interested in something because it's new, whereas if the story's been touted around a lot, they'll be aware of it, but then everybody else will be aware of it. They'll have done so much, they'll be bored with it. They're only interested if it's brand new and shiny.
No. It's not that it's new, but the thing is that if it's been shopped around, it means that everybody's done the due diligence, everybody's looked at the IP, and it's not that it's new, it's just that everybody's aware of it. Whereas what they want is they want to keep the know-how as tightly as possible, and that's the advantage of what Andy Richards was describing as stealth investing. So I'm not really sure that it actually is that secret, but I can sort of see that there are some advantages to it. You were on the Bioforecaster panel. I mean, what other issues came up that are key to what people are thinking about for next year?
Well, one of the things that came up, which is fairly topical, I think, for a number of reasons, is the theme that large pharmaceutical companies, the very biggest, particularly Pfizer, GSK, and Sanofi Aventis, are making moves in various ways at this time, perhaps coincidentally, into the rare or orphan disease area. So, I suppose Sanofi's entrance depends on its acquisition of Genzyme, at which point it will be acquiring lots of kind of niche drugs and experimental drugs going to those sorts of diseases. Pfizer acquired Foldarex, and GSK announced relatively recently that it was setting up a specialist unit to deal with rare diseases. But, I mean, you actually spoke with Sheila Wilson, who's the VP of that GSK unit, didn't you, at Biopartnering? So what did she have to say about, why they're getting into it? It seems a little bit odd to me. They've stayed away for a long time. It's been the province of the biotech, or some biotech companies. Some biotech companies made a very big business out of it, Genzyme particularly. So why the big companies now, and why now?
When people looked at the rare diseases in the first place and thought, oh, well, this is an interesting spot, why would pharmaceuticals want to get in there? Actually, when one looks at even the common diseases, what you're actually looking at is very, very sort of small markets. So, for example, the number of sort of cancer patients in Europe is only like 25 million. When you look at all the rare diseases that take place in Europe, there are 7,000 rare diseases, and there are about 25 million sufferers of those rare diseases. So in fact, you're kind of looking at the sort of the same ballpark. Now, obviously, you're not going to go for all 7,000 diseases, but what somebody like GSK has done is that they've looked at it and sort of, cut it down to like 200 diseases that they think that they could, have a look at. Now, what's important about these rare diseases that makes them, again, very attractive is, one, they tend to be very genetic. Okay, so there's an obvious genetic cause, and many of them actually are monogenic, i.e. it's one gene fault that's taken place. So actually the populations are identifiable. That's the first thing. The second thing is actually they are seriously debilitating. So they actually, if somebody actually comes up with a treatment, it really, really does make a difference to people's lives. Thirdly, they're associated, one, with highly committed patient organizations, and two, highly committed clinicians. So therefore, you can actually identify your patient population. You know what the target is. And it's actually, the clinical trials are actually fairly easy to do. So, because, you can identify who they are and what the endpoints are.
So you're saying that Big Pharma suddenly decided that getting into the clinical arena quicker, even though the patient population is relatively minuscule, is where they want to be. I still don't quite get that transition. Why has that transition happened? Because those rare diseases have been around for a long time. There have been lots of drugs developed by companies like Genzyme that they've shown that there's a market there, and yet the big companies haven't been there. So has something happened?
There has, in terms of what we're actually seeing is that the way that healthcare payers, the National Health Services or the insurance companies, what they're all looking for is are you producing the drugs for the right patient groups? So therefore, there's patient stratification, whether it is, for cancers, so, HER2, NOI receptors in breast cancer, whatever. You have the drug that is targeted at the right people. Here, you've actually already got a population which actually says, we are a target population. We are easily identifiable. So all of a sudden, the pharmaceutical companies have realized, actually, if all diseases are going to be stratified, why not go for those that it's actually clearly identifiable?
So genetic diseases are stratified diseases for which you don't really have to develop a genetic test, or you don't have to develop one. The patients are pre-identified.
Yes.
And they are somewhat uniform, I suppose. I don't know to what extent that's true, but...
Well, I mean, in terms of, like, if you have a lysosomal disorder, like Gaucher's disease or Fabry's disease, you are a clearly identified patient group. And in fact, what actually happens is that these diseases are so severe that the unmet clinical need is so great that actually you really do make a difference. And that's why I'm saying that the patient populations here and the people who are treating them and their families, everybody is totally committed to actually finding a cure. So it's actually, it's that terrible win-win situation of this is the reason why they're getting in there.
So, Mike, the Lancet was recently calling for greater attention to stratified medicine from the pharmaceutical companies. I wasn't quite sure that they weren't already doing that, but this is part of that activity from what you're saying. Another question that occurs to me, however, is there some transition from the rare disease situation into something that you could develop a compound for a rare disease, get it through the trials quickly, obtain an orphan status because of the nature of the disease. So things are rather accelerated in terms of development. Can you then take that compound to a broader population? Is that part of GSK's thinking, for instance, from your conversation with Sheila Wilson?
That isn't what was explicitly said. However, what's interesting, one of the things that they are doing is that they're looking at the compounds they already have and actually sort of seeing, can some of these be repurposed and reprofiled to actually fit into a rare disease space? So that is clearly a possibility. But what you're actually saying is that, in fact, many of the biotech drugs were actually developed as orphan drugs. And then what happened was that they realized that there were other indications so that it could expand it. So, for example, EPO was originally considered an orphan drug. And what actually happened with that orphan status was they had all the marketing advantages that you get with orphan status, whether it's 7 years market exclusivity or 10 years marketing exclusivity. So that's the difference. So there is that possibility, but actually I don't think that's driving it. I actually think that in some respects, part of the driver is almost trying to rebuild the reputation with the patient community. The pharmaceutical industry kind of recognizes that, its reputation is in some respects lower than that of the tobacco industry. I'm afraid that is all we've got time for today. More information about this and other industry relevant issues can be found at our website, www.scripintelligence.com. We hope that you have found this podcast a useful and appealing addition to our portfolio of intelligence outputs. We welcome all feedback to help us improve our offering. So once again, thanks for listening.